Oh, hello folks. This is Steve A. for you. Now you know that nothing in this episode is a promotion, nor is it a recommendation. And additionally, you must keep in mind that I'm just an idiot running his mouth. Nothing that I say is authoritative. Now everybody is aware of the news. But I want to talk about this. Investigators probe dirty fuel in the Baltimore container ship disaster amid mid-Atlantic supply chain crisis. Now, what are we talking about? Catastrophic supply chain snarls are materializing in the mid-Atlantic area. North Carolina is in the mid-Atlantic, just on the southern edge of it, after a container ship rammed a 1.6 mile long bridge, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, at the port of Baltimore. I just saw in the news that President Biden claims that when he would commute from his estate to Baltimore, he would take the train across that bridge. Except there's no railroad tracks on that bridge. It's like he used to drive a 16-wheeler, you know? Anyway, I have driven a car across, but not recently. And it is a long bridge, causing the bridge to collapse and paralyzing terminals along the port. Now, what we're going to kind of key in on is the next paragraph. Excuse me. Before we shed more color on the worsening supply chain issues, a new Wall Street Journal report cites people familiar with the investigation into the crash as saying contaminated fuel could have contributed to the container ship Dolly losing power. According to the Coast Guard briefing report viewed by this Wall Street Journal, the ship Dolly's ship lights began to flicker about an hour after the ship began steaming down the marine channel out of the Baltimore inner harbor. Now I'm going to remind you of something. A really long time ago, in 1966, I gained working passage on a Norwegian freighter, the Irfanview, working passage on a freighter from Rotterdam, Holland, across the Atlantic, northern arc to south of Iceland, and into the St. Lawrence Seaway, and I got off that ship at Hamilton, Ontario. So I've actually worked on a freighter. That doesn't make me an expert. Pardon me. Who was Francis Scott Key? Why would they name a bridge after him? Now take a look. Do you see the shape of this? They say this was the terminal that the ship left from. Now, the ship I was on might have been able to make as much as, with no wind on the forecastle, maybe 12 knots an hour. So when it says an hour, when they started, they have to check out that everything is working, and they're not going they're going slowly. And when I was on that freighter, one time the chief engineer took me down to the engine room. Boy, was it loud, where the big diesel engines were. Now, we had electric lights on that ship. We had an electric pump that ran the air compressor for me doing the chipping the paint on the deck. That's what my job was, because they would chip the paint off and then repaint the ship to keep it from rusting. The Norwegians are like that. So it said the lights on the ship began to flicker. Well, you know, when Magellan sailed around the world, they didn't have electricity. So when they were steering the ship, there was a rope or chain and a system of pulleys that went all the way to the back rudder, and that's how you would be steering the ship. And the reason why that particular ship comes to mind. Now remember, my mind wanders, and I've had a lot of experience. I had a downstairs neighbor where I lived in Philadelphia who was a photographer, scuba diver, and he actually had dove as part of an archaeological expedition to Magellan's ship. And he had some artifacts from it that they had lent to him to photograph for a magazine article, and he invited me to hold the magnetized crude iron bar, which was one of two from one of the two compasses on Magellan's flagship that sunk in a bay in the Philippines. And he had dived down there and he helped retrieve items like that. See, I'm almost a seaman. Well, the diesel engines in that ship were running electrical generators to power the lights, to power the steering mechanism, and the navigation equipment. And they called Mayday because at first the power was flickering and then went out. And what that means is the main diesel engine stopped, and therefore the electrical generation stopped. And obviously they don't carry battery banks if they lost all their power, which means they lost their steering, which means they would be following whatever the current in that channel is. Now look at this picture. See, look at this picture. Francis Scott Key Bridge opened in 1977. Materials made from steel, 1.6 miles, 4 lanes. It's I-695, 11.3 million vehicles per year. Baltimore is a major seaport, cargo port specifically. If they've got all those ships going on, who was the genius that forgot to build a stone protective wall around those piers so that a collision could never take the bridge down? Oh, that's hindsight. So it's the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Now I'm thinking about what, like second or third grade, memorizing the words to the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. Pardon me. Attorney Francis Scott Key witnessed the 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry from a British troop ship anchored some 4 miles away. He had boarded the ship to negotiate the release of an American civilian imprisoned by the British and had been detained. But once they're going to start shooting or get prepper, they're not going to let some American go and run and tell them about it. and had been detained aboard as the bombardment began. On September 14th, 1814, what war would that be? Not the American Revolutionary War, which we had part of in this area. No, that would be the War of 1812. On September 14th, 1814, as the dawn's early light revealed the flag flying over the Fort McHenry, after they'd been bombarded by the British fleet all night long, Key exuberantly began jotting down the lines of the song that became our national anthem. Now, the rocket's red glare. And that's a cover from a book. Can I imagine that? And notice the British were firing not cannons, but rockets. See, that sounds really modern, doesn't it? Thinking of the Middle East, where I spent 4 years in Israel, including 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 in Western Galilee, right on the Israel-Lebanon border. And the army came there and they set up, and there were 2 permanent mortar pits on that settlement. And the army took over one of them, and oh yeah, I've seen at least 100 Katyusha rockets flying overhead out of Lebanon to bombard Israel. Look at that picture. And that mortar was assigned that every night, starting at 8:20 p.m., he would fire for 20 minutes into Lebanon to predetermined targets, fire the mortar for 20 minutes, and then he would stop, and there were other mortar emplacements in the area, and each night, starting at 8:20, he would fire for 20 minutes, 4 times altogether, finishing at 3 a.m., in order to try to suppress the Philistine terrorists from firing their Katyushas into Israel to destroy us. So I look at that picture and I can imagine what it was like. What were they shooting at? This is a satellite view of the Baltimore Harbor. There's Fort McHenry. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a pentagon. I wonder if that's why they shaped the Pentagon as that. Was it to commemorate this? Now, let's take a look. You see this right here? This would be a tunnel. That's I-95. Which one did they say was the Francis Scott Key? Here's I-895. I'm forgetting. Are you helping me? Now let's back off a little more. Can we see the terminal where the ship left? Now there's Fort McHenry, but let's talk about this bridge right down here, the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. And here's something called Fort Carroll. Is it unusual to have a military fort, especially way back in the mouth of a harbor if there's a convenient island? And here's the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And you remember I said pay attention to the shape of this because the terminal it left from was right here. And we can see that it's not that far from Fort McHenry. I'm just orienting you. And look at all the cargo right there. This is a satellite view. Look at all those containers stacked up, ready to be were unloaded or to be loaded onto a container ship. Before we shed more color on the worsening supply chain issues, a new Wall Street Journal report cites people familiar with the investigation into the crash as saying contaminated fuel could have contributed to the ship's losing power. The main engine stopped, therefore the electrical generator that's being run stops and the power goes off and all navigation instrumentation ceases. Wall Street Journal. Look at all those containers on that ship, just like we saw in the picture. And there's the bridge where it fell down and trapped that ship. Ain't going nowhere soon. A safety probe into the Baltimore bridge collapse will include whether contaminated fuel played a role in a giant cargo ship losing power and crashing into the span, according to people familiar with the investigation. Now, what does this lead up to? This leads up to another aspect of my personal experience. Is that a credible potential scenario to explain why the ship lost power, became essentially rudderless, and drifted and crashed into the bridge span, which was not protected? The pier was not protected, and bringing the bridge down. Now, actually, in the past, I've made a video about this. The video was, I suggested that when you go into a gas station and you can see the fueling tanker there, keep going. Don't get your gas then. Why? You see the hoses? There's two hoses coming out of this, and it's connected to, see, these plates can be, he's getting ready to set up another one. These are the entrance openings to the storage containers that are under the pavement. And pumps suck fuel from those underground tanks up through the, right here, for you to put in your car. Pardon me. Now, what did that video suggest to you? If you see a tanker in the process of dropping the fuel at a station, keep going. Pardon me. Because that fuel going down into the underground tank creates a lot of turbulence. They try to filter it, but something that gets down into those tanks is water. By atmospheric condensation, if only that. And the tanks at the bottom under the ground are shaped to have a sump area at the bottom where that water is heavier than petrol. So it will migrate down into the sump area. Now let's go back to the 1970s. I had returned to college and I was working part-time with pickup jobs in my brother's foreign car repair shop. We had a customer that was a teacher at the elementary school in town, but she lived way out of town, about 10 miles away. She used to commute every day, And we received a call mid-morning that she wanted us, my brother, to take his trailer and go get her husband's Volkswagen Beetle. Like that. Only it's this one. Like that. You remember them, don't you? And she was insistent, please go now. He's trying to fix this himself. He's going to ruin the car. Tony, go get that's my brother's name. Please go get him in. So we went. I went too. He was also on his way to work. He had left the house, and he stopped at a gas station that was next to the entrance to an interstate, the ramp, to fuel up. So he's pumping in whatever number of gallons it is into the Beetle, and he pays for it. And then he starts to drive away, and he gets about 30, 40 feet, and the car just quits. And he can't start it. And then he notices that there's a couple of other cars in the plaza. It's not a particularly large station, but it was next to the ramp to getting on an interstate. There's a couple of other cars that they're waiting for tows also. Why? What happened? Now take a look at that tanker. How many grades of gas are there at your pump? Where you go? I just refueled an hour ago, and there were 3 grades plus diesel. Diesel's a separate pump. But on the single pump, I could choose one of 3 octanes. So that means that this tanker has to have at least 3 compartments, right? And you can see he's got down more than one hose. So he's filling from more than one compartment. Because, all right, he's filling more than one underground tank simultaneously. Now, I don't know how it is today, but we're going to talk about the 1970s where I grew up. One of the things the guys did, one of the compartments in the tanker was for waste water. What they would do is they would put a stick down that hole, which also went straight down to where the belly button on the bottom of the underground tank was, in order to bring the stick back up and look at the water beads to see how much water was in the sump area. And if there was more than a certain amount, he was supposed to put a special tube down there and pump the water out into one of the compartments of the tanker. Now you see how they're hooked up to the tanker? Well, there's a switch behind those to which partition a nozzle is actually going to take from. And that morning, apparently, the delivery guy was snoring, and he didn't pump gasoline into the tank. He pumped wastewater from the sump partition and filled that tank up with water. And he had just left a few minutes before those other people and our customer's husband pulled in to fill up. And he filled his tank with water, which is why he only got about 6 feet, because it was enough to just get the fuel in the carburetor burned, and then it starts pulling the water from the tank, and boom, you're finished. We put this car up on the trailer, we brought it back to the shop, we took the gas tank out, in order to clean it and make sure there was no residual water left. I rebuilt the carburetor. I had to get the water out of all the little passageways and nozzles, and we flushed out the fuel line. She didn't want him to try to do that because she knew it was more complicated than he realized. And yes, when they took our bill back to that gas station, they were prepared to pay cash. Just show us the receipt, cash, no questions. That's how they took care of it. I'm talking about personal experience. Do you think the container ship, when it was loading up, do you think it also refueled? I do. If you go and look at the satellite view, are there fuel tanks in the I'm not sure which one. Are there any fuel tanks visible? I'll bet if we look around, we'll find some. You notice all these, oh yeah, there's some right there. There they are, right there. So the tanker was fueled up, and they can call it contaminated fuel. But I'm giving you the example with cars, what I have direct personal experience with, and this possibility, to me, is very credible. Before we shed more color on the worsening supply chain issues, a new Wall Street Journal report cites people familiar with the investigation into the crash as saying contaminated fuel, either the wrong fuel or water. Or you think they don't sump the fuel tanks of those things that have been in the ocean? Do you think they don't get water in them? Saying contaminated fuel may have contributed to the container ship losing power and drifting into the bridge pier and collapsing it. Steve A. before you, just letting his mind wander, reminiscing a bit, and brainstorming it, saying see you in 73.